This video will help you complete your independent learning activity on social learning theory. You'll need your approaches booklet open at page 17. So let's start. At the top of page 17 is an introduction to social learning theory. Pictured here is Albert Bandura. He's one of the most famous psychologists of all time. He's also probably the most famous social learning theorists. Social learning theory is also known as the social cognitive approach because it involves elements of social factors, i.e. people around us, and cognitive factors, i.e. the way we think and decision making. Bandura believed that not all learning occurs as a result of direct experience. So this goes in opposition to operant conditioning, which states that you have to directly be rewarded yourself in order to learn a behaviour. Bandura believed instead that we can learn just by watching other people. We ourselves don't have to be rewarded for the behaviour. So this is quite a complex theory in comparison to behaviourist theory because it takes into account all of those factors. Okay, we're going to start looking at a few key terms that you're expected to know because these are all on the spec, each of these headings. So we've got the term modelling. That's simply when a model, a person, shows you how to do a behaviour. So modelling is when an individual carries out a behaviour and we observe them doing this. Now models can be live or they can be symbolic. Just write in these examples. Live models include parents, siblings, teachers and peers. These are basically people who you have direct interaction with in real life. Symbolic models are characters on TV or celebrities in the media, i.e. people who you don't directly interact with, but you could still learn from them. They can still model behaviours for you. So the models demonstrate behaviours and we learn the behaviours in that way. Now, imitation is obviously copying, it's reproducing a model's behaviour. Just write in next to the word imitation on page 17, write in this yellow comment. Modelling doesn't necessarily lead to imitation, but usually it leads to internalisation. This means we learn the behaviour, we take it on board, but we don't necessarily always imitate it. Whether we imitate the behaviour depends on a number of factors. So if you just turn now to page 18, 3 things that make imitation more likely to occur after modelling. 1, if we identify with the model. More on that on the next slide. 2, we need to perceive that we've the ability to perform the model's behaviour. And 3, we need to expect that the behaviour will have positive consequences for us. So if those 3 things happen, then we're likely to imitate the behaviour that's been modelled. If not, then we'll internalise the behaviour, but we won't necessarily imitate it. Next is identification. Identification means we want to be like or want to be associated with a person, and that becomes a motivation for imitating them. So in the box, just write identification means wanting to be like or wanting to be associated with the model. Now, in order to identify with a model, we have to feel that they are similar to us in some way. For example, we're more likely to imitate same-sex models because we feel that we're similar to them. Identifying with the model suggests that we're likely to experience the same outcomes or consequences as the model. So that's why we're more likely to imitate models we identify with. Because we feel we're similar to them, and therefore we're more likely to get the same consequences as them. Now, a difference between social learning theory and operant conditioning is in the use of the term reinforcement. According to Skinner, in operant conditioning, reinforcement is the direct experience of pleasant consequences for a behaviour. Now, Bandura believed that we don't have to directly experience those pleasant consequences in order to be likely to perform a behaviour. It's enough to be vicariously reinforced for a behaviour. Vicarious reinforcement occurs when we observe the model being reinforced for their behaviour. So let's just be clear on this. It's not us, the observer, who's getting rewarded for a behaviour. It's us seeing the model getting rewarded for the behaviour. That's vicarious reinforcement. And this can motivate us to imitate the model's behaviour. So over onto page 19, it says that when an individual receives vicarious reinforcement, remember that just means they've seen the model be rewarded for a behaviour. When that happens, this gives them some feedback on what the consequences of the behaviour are likely to be. And then the observer judges for themselves the likelihood that they'll get those same outcomes if they imitate the behaviour. Once a behaviour has been modelled, and once potentially vicarious reinforcement has occurred, mediational processes occur. These are the internal mental processes, in other words, the thoughts that occur after you've observed a model's behaviour. So what happens is you form a mental representation of the behaviour that's been modelled and its likely outcomes. And instead of automatically reproducing that behaviour, which is what is said to happen in operant conditioning, the individual thinks about whether imitating that behaviour is likely to produce desirable outcomes. So it's not an automatic production of behaviour once a reward has happened. We have to think about it and make a decision about whether to imitate that behaviour. That decision, whether or not to imitate the model, is based on things like vicarious reinforcement. So if the model's been seen to be rewarded, we're more likely to decide to imitate. And the other thing that it might depend on is self-efficacy. This means our confidence in our own capabilities to successfully reproduce the model's behaviour. If we have high self-efficacy, then we think that we'll get the same rewards as we've seen the model get, so we're more likely to decide to imitate. Okay, at this point there's a consolidation task in your booklet. So you need to read the item, and underneath it, in that little space at the bottom of the page, make a list of responses to the question underneath the item. So just pause the video and do that now. Okay, finally we're going to talk about Bandura's research. So you already know about this from the summer homework. Much of this will be a recap, but it's very important that you write out in full a detailed description of the original study on page 20 and 21. So just a bit of background and just to jog your memory first. In the 1960s, Bandura designed an experimental procedure to test social learning in the lab. And this procedure involved modelling aggressive behaviour to children and providing them with an opportunity to imitate. So his research question was, will children imitate aggression if that is modelled for them in the lab? In the decade that followed the original 1961 experiment, Bandura did a lot of variations on the same theme to test the effects of different variables. And you need to write down a couple of these variations as well briefly. But for the time being, we're going to focus on the original Bobo doll experiment, which was in 1961. So don't write any of this down, but this is just a reminder. This was a lab experiment. Children observed a model live behaving either aggressively or passively towards an inflatable. The children observed to see whether they imitated what they'd observed. Later variations including a TV version as opposed to a live version and a vicarious reinforcement condition. So you may remember for the summer homework watching this YouTube video. You will need to now pause this video and play the one that's shown on this slide. And once you've done that, you'll need to read page 28. That's a detailed description of the original study as well. Once you've done all of that, you will then be in a position to fill in page 20 and 21. So you need to fill in the subheadings, complete the sentences, and try to write your own aim and conclusion. If you prefer to do this in rough and then you can check it during the lesson, then that's fine, but make sure you do have a go at it, please. Once you've described the study, there's also a box on page 21 where you're asked to summarise briefly one or two of the follow-up studies and their findings. So where you'll find this information is in the video that you'll have just rewatched. One of the follow-up studies was mentioned at the end of that. And there's also a mention of a follow-up study in the final sentence of page 28 that you've just read. So what I'd like you to do here in the box on page 21 is describe briefly one or both of those follow-up studies, and just make sure that in what you put you make clear how it was different from the original procedure and what the main finding was. Okay, final task now is to have a go at completing the discussion points or the evaluation of social learning theory. On page 22 and 23 there are 4 evaluation points which I've just summarised here. So there's 3 positives and a negative. What you'll need to do is read through those points carefully and complete as many of the blanks as you can. You may not be able to do absolutely all of them, but do make an attempt to do as many as you possibly can. The final point about reductionism is difficult, but if you need help with this one, read over the reductionist point about behaviourism on page 16, because this one is basically saying the opposite to that, that it is not reductionist, or it's at least less reductionist than behaviourism. Okay, and that's it. That's your independent learning for this half term. So you can stop the video or pause the video now and do your best to complete everything by the deadline.